Good afternoon. I'm Ken Weinstein, President and CEO of Hudson Institute. I'd like to welcome our audience here at the Walter and Betsy Stern Conference Center, as well as our very distinguished panelists to today's discussion on organizing the U.S. government to counter Islamic extremism. Hudson Institute is a future-oriented international policy research organization founded 51 years ago by the late Herman Kahn. Our research seeks to forge ideas that promote security, prosperity, and freedom. I also want to give a special welcome to our live viewers on Ustream and to the folks in the viewing audience at home on C-SPAN. I also want to thank the good folks at C-SPAN for carrying this important discussion. Today's discussion is important because I think that there is broad agreement on a bipartisan basis here in Washington, some 11 years after 9/11, that the U.S. government has yet to figure out an effective way to challenge the ideology that is the driving force behind Islamic radicalism and behind terrorism. The fact that we have some of Washington's leading public intellectuals with us today is emblematic, I believe, of the magnitude of this problem. The occasion for this event is the rollout of a new and insightful report that Hudson Institute has published. And the report is here, Organizing for a Strategic Ideas Campaign to Counter Ideological Challenges to U.S. National Security. The report was written by Hudson scholars Douglas Feith and Abe Shulsky, both of whom served with distinction in Republican administrations at the Pentagon and in Doug's case at the White House, and Brookings Institution scholar William Galston, who served with distinction in the Clinton White House, and we'll be hearing from them shortly. Rounding out the panel are two individuals who have played critical roles in public policy debates over some time here in Washington. Ambassador James Glassman, who is the founding executive director of the George W. Bush Institute and who served as Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs in the Bush administration, and Will Marshall, the president of the Progressive Policy Institute. All of whom, I should add, are old friends of Hudson Institute, and Bill Galston, we're much more accustomed to having you appear on our domestic policy panel discussions than on this one, and this is a real treat. I think of this report as a quintessential Hudson Institute study because it ties together ideas, strategy, and the implementation, the practical implementation of policy. Organizing for a Strategic Ideas Campaign specifically looks at how the government should organize itself to counter Islamic extremism. And you can download the report at our website at www.hudson.org. I should note that in addition to this important work, Hudson has, of course, done significant work on Islamic extremism, primarily through our Center on Islam, Democracy, and the Future of the Muslim World, and its journal, Current Trends in Islamist Ideology, which is the world's leading journal analyzing the ideological component of Islamic radicalism. And in addition, we've done important work on the impact that Islamic radicalism has, especially on non-Muslim minority populations in the Middle East and elsewhere, through our Center on Religious Freedom. I now have the pleasure to turn the program over to our moderator, Douglas Feith, who is director of Hudson's Center for National Security Strategies. Doug has a very strong grasp of this subject. From the theoretical point of view as someone who follows Islamist ideology closely, but also from a more practical point of view, as Doug worked on developing the strategy for the war against terrorism when he served as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy in the George W. Bush administration. It's now my pleasure to turn the microphone over to Doug.
Thank you, Ken. I also would like to welcome everybody here in the room and the people who are following us on the live streaming and our C-SPAN audience. This new report that we're discussing today, which is available to everybody on the Hudson.org website, is called Organizing for a Strategic Ideas Campaign to Counter Ideological Challenges to U.S. National Security. And it grew out of experiences that I and others in the government had in the aftermath of the 9/11 attack. The strategy for responding to that attack had three major elements. The first was protecting the homeland. The second was disrupting and attacking terrorist networks abroad. And the third was countering ideological support for terrorism. Now, the first two became elements of the strategy for which an enormous amount of effort was developed and put in, and they've been remarkably successful in that, you know, here we are, 11 years later, and we have not had the follow-on attack that pretty much everybody anticipated back in 2001. But this third element, countering ideological support for terrorism, has, to put it mildly, been underdeveloped. I mean, it's basically, I would argue, been a hole in our strategy. And when the topic arose of what do we do in the realm of ideas after 9/11 to deal with the Islamist extremism problem, officials of the U.S. government, many of them from the State Department, which was assumed to be the logical place for the effort to be made on the ideological front, many of the officials responded by discussing public diplomacy. The State Department has an office of public diplomacy. And the focus tended to be on messages that American officials can transmit into the Muslim world. So, for example, when we would early on after 9/11 have meetings to discuss the ideological effort, officials from the State Department would show up with glossy brochures showing smiling Muslim children going to school freely in the United States, which is fine. It's an important point about the United States and about religious liberty in the United States and about the attitude toward Islam. And that was fine as far as it went, but from the point of view of a number of us, it was but a very thin slice of what needed to be done to have a comprehensive effort to counter Islamist ideology, the extremist ideology that was motivating the terrorist attacks. Now, we believe, and the authors of this report believe, that the key issue is not the messages that American officials transmit into the Muslim world. The key issue is what Muslim communities are saying within their communities, what Muslims are saying to Muslims. And there's a need for the United States to take on the ideology. There is much more to this problem of terrorism than simply capturing or killing terrorists. We need to try to prevent people from becoming committed enemies of the United States, of Western liberal democracy to begin with. And we often use the metaphor of a treadmill. We said that if the United States does not make a serious effort on the ideological front, and all we do are capture and kill operations, we are going to be on a treadmill that is likely to be accelerating over time. What a number of us advocated was an operational approach to identify voices in the Muslim world that are important to this debate, important for good and important for ill, and to amplify the positive voices and to counter the negative voices. Now, this is a lot more than just public diplomacy or strategic communications. What we are advocating is an operational approach. This idea of amplifying and countering voices is not a matter of messaging for U.S. officials. Those are really a different way of thinking about the problem, and we're advocating a much more serious operational approach that also recognizes the enormous diversity of people in the world and the fact that there's no one right avenue. The ideology needs to be tackled at multiple levels, from the intellectual and theological to the level of popular entertainment. And we think that if the U.S. government had a proper strategy in this area, it would involve numerous activities aiming at at different types of ways of persuading people, and it would not be an academic exercise alone. It would not be a just a popular television approach either, but it would probably combine multiple approaches. Alas, there is no office in the U.S. government with the responsibility to counter hostile ideologies in general, or Islamist extremism in particular. In the Cold War, work of this kind was done by the U.S. Information Agency, but that organization was put out of existence in the late 1990s. President Bush never actually gave this mission to any department or task force. Jim Glassman attempted to adopt the mission when he was undersecretary, but he was confirmed late. He was in office for just a few months, and it was the most promising attempt in this area, but it only lasted a few months. President Obama has also failed to assign the mission to anyone. His top counterterrorism advisor, John Brennan, has gone out of his way to downplay the ideological nature of the terrorism problem. In all events, as I said, there's a hole in U.S. strategy on this subject that's remained unfilled since 9/11 and remains unfilled to this day. In our report, the three authors, Abe Shulsky, Bill Galston, and myself, argue that the U.S. government should have the capability to counter hostile ideologies, that tackling Islamist extremism is important not only because of terrorism, but also in light of the political upheavals underway now throughout the Middle East, which have already brought to power Islamist parties in Tunisia, in Egypt, and maybe soon in Syria. I'd like to call now on my co-authors to review briefly some of the main ideas in our report. And then I'll ask our outside commentators, Jim Glassman and Will Marshall, to offer their remarks. And after that, I hope that we'll be able to take some questions from the audience. And for those of you not in the room, you can submit questions via Twitter to @Hudson Institute, one word. Now it's my pleasure to call upon Abram Shulsky, who is a senior fellow here at Hudson. Before coming here, he served as an advisor to me and Secretary Rumsfeld in dealing with issues related to Iraq mainly and the global war on terrorism. In previous positions, he served dealing with a number of national security related affairs, including as director at the Pentagon of Strategic Arms Control Policy and legislative assistant to the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan with regard to intelligence issues. He's the author of a college textbook on intelligence called Silent Warfare: Understanding the World of Intelligence. And it's a pleasure to call Abe to the microphone.
Thank you very much. Just want to make a few comments on Islamism itself to just give you a feel for the kind of discussion we have in the report, where we go into this in much greater detail. It's a very complicated phenomenon with lots of different strands and individuals and movements. But I think the most important point for our purposes is to emphasize that when we talk of Islamism, we're talking about a political ideology. That is to say, it's a program for reshaping society as a whole, political life, the economy, everything, according to some set of ideas. And its impact, therefore, is in the political realm, just as previous kinds of ideologies that became important had that kind of impact. And this is a really crucial point because obviously U.S. government officials are very reluctant, and reasonably so, to get involved in what seem like debates about religion. Take the First Amendment seriously. That's not the government's job to get into those kinds of questions. Nevertheless, in this case, I think we have to look at it as something that has these great political effects. Now, Of course, it's true that Islamism claims to be the correct interpretation of the religion of Islam. Nevertheless, it's important to note that it's far from being identical with it, at least it's far from being identical with the kind of Islam that has existed traditionally over a period of 1400 years. And in many respects, it goes against traditional Islamic scholarship and jurisprudence. There's lots of examples one could give. Perhaps one of the more striking and, from our point of view, important ones is the fact that traditionally, to issue a fatwa, which is to say advice on what is permitted and what is not permitted in the religion, i.e. religious advice, you had to be a trained cleric. You had to have studied the Quran, you had to have studied Islamic jurisprudence, you had to be recognized as somebody, in a sense, who knew what he was talking about, rather reasonable. The notion that a layman like bin Laden could issue fatwas, which he claimed to do, is really quite a different kettle of fish. It's quite a departure from the ordinary understandings of traditional Islam. Now, as Doug mentioned, from the current point of view, extremist Islamism poses a number of problems, challenges to our national security. But I think a key basis of all of this, and one of the important characteristics that we should always be looking at, is that the extremist versions of Islamism begin with an assumption of an inevitable hostility of the West towards Islam, i.e. therefore the necessary sort of inevitable hostility between the West and Islam. It's rather central, I think, to the challenge posed. And let me read you a little bit from Syed Qutb, who was one of the main ideologists of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. It's admittedly an extreme passage, but I think it captures some of the sense of this. I mean, he says that it's a permanent state of affairs for truth to be unable to coexist with falsehood on earth. Hence, when Islam makes its declaration for the liberation of man on earth, so that they may serve God only, those who usurp God's authority, i.e. people like us who have democratic votes to determine who the authority is in our country, try to silence it. They will never tolerate it or leave it in peace. And from this, of course, he concludes that Islam has to fight back and so forth. So it's in a way similar to the situation with respect to communism, where the official line was always not that we communists are going to use force to spread our ideology, but rather the bourgeoisie will always try to use force to stop the inevitable victory of communism, which would come about through economic forces and the rest of it. So therefore, there's an inevitable hostility, but it's because the other guy is hostile to me. Anyway, I think, as Doug mentioned, our whole ability to influence ideological trends has become much more important now, even than it was before, because of the results of the Arab Spring that has brought Islamist governments to power. And a very key question for these governments that we should be trying to figure out how we can influence is whether or not they will, in fact, assume this inevitable hostility, or whether they will adopt a much more pragmatic approach as they face the actual problems of governing these societies. So this just give you a little sense of the kind of analysis that we went through in the report underlying many of the proposals that we had. Now I'd like to turn it over to Bill.
Yeah, I'd like to call on our third co-author, William Galston, who holds the Ezra Zilcha Chair in the Brookings Institution's Governance Studies program, where Bill is a senior fellow. Bill's also College Park professor at the University of Maryland. He's participated in 6 presidential campaigns and served from 1993 to 95 as Deputy Assistant to President Clinton for Domestic Policy. Bill is a director of the National Endowment for Democracy and the author of 8 books and more than 100 articles in the fields of political theory, public policy, and American politics. Bill.
Well, right at the beginning, Ken Weinstein
expressed his surprise that I was here in this particular distinguished company. I share that surprise to some extent myself, but but let me tell you how I participated in this study. Unlike my colleagues, I have not served in the U.S. government on the defense or foreign policy side. I am certainly not a student of Islamism. I know a little about it, but not enough to orate for more than a minute. What I do focus on is political institutions. If there are particular kinds of tasks to be carried out, what is the best way of organizing the government to get a particular job done? And depending on the job, the answers will be very different. And so I principally contributed to that portion of the report. Having said that, I just want to underscore points that Doug and Abe have both made, and I want to say it in my own language as clearly as I can. The focus of this report is not Islam, nor is it Islamism in all of its manifestations. The focus of this report is on that variety of Islamism that rejects democracy, rejects pluralism, and legitimates violence not only against legitimate governments but against civilians. That is the focus of this report. And we begin on pages 1 and 2 with a very careful distinction between that target on the one hand and the democratic movements and phenomena that have elevated Islamist movement to power in different ways in Tunisia and Egypt. We want there to be no misunderstanding about what we're talking about. Okay, with that, let me turn very briefly to an institutional analysis. A little bit of history. As you know, there was a strong ideological component to the Cold War, and the U.S. Information Agency was created to take the lead in that component of the struggle. After the Cold War ended, it was widely believed that, well, the ideological wars of the 20th century had ended with the decisive victory, of Western, liberal, democratic, free markets and capitalism, et cetera, against all the ideological foes of the 20th century. Ideological history had ended. We had won. We can shut down the factory and go home. And it didn't take many years before the USIA was dismantled. Some of its functions were transferred to the State Department. Others were transferred to the Broadcasting Board of Government. And then 9/11 happened, and suddenly people woke up and said, hey, maybe ideological history hasn't quite ended after all. Now what do we do? And over the decade, there was an increasing sense that an important capacity within the government had been lost. And there were a large number of commissions and reports between 2002 and the current year that have made versions of that point. And so the question is what to do. And in our report, we work very carefully through a number of different options. How do you answer that question? What should we do? We talked about the possibility of a 21st century USIA, reconstituting the USIA. We looked briefly at the possibility that the Department of Defense could take the lead. We looked much more extensively at the idea that the State Department could take the lead. We looked at the idea that the National Security Council should take the lead, and that a non-governmental organization might be constituted to take the lead. And we found a case to be made for each one of those options. In the end, we recommend an NSC in the lead model backed by a non-governmental organization, a 501c3, which is capable of conducting research, commissioning research, mobilizing intellectual and not such intellectual resources, etc. If I had a lot more time, I would go through the considerations that led us down this path, and perhaps in the question and answer period, we can talk in greater detail about the reasons that led us to be skeptical of the USIA model, to reject a leadership role for DOD, to raise serious questions about the capacity of the State Department to take the lead, etc. And let me just spend a couple of minutes focusing on the recommendations that we did make. We talk, first of all, about putting a reconfigured National Security Council in the lead, a Deputy Assistant to the President for National Security, presiding over an empowered interagency committee, the Counterterrorist Ideology Committee, and to ensure both congressional buy-in and appropriate executive branch authority, we believe that this new configuration should be created through legislation. There will be, in our recommendation, a presidential executive order, but it is supplementary. It is not the primary source of the authority of this new entity. We go into some detail about a decision-making process within this committee and above this committee if the committee cannot resolve the issues. We also talk about a new Center for Counterterrorism Research. We explored a number of different models and concluded that a 501c3 organization that could receive both public and non-public funds would be the most appropriate vehicle, and it has a number of different roles, including conducting and commissioning research, mobilizing and convening networks of experts, establishing high-quality flagship publications, making grants to foreign nationals and foreign organizations who are involved operationally along the lines that Doug talked about, involving the private sector, and rendering advice to the U.S. government, but not taking orders from it. This would be an independent entity. The third component of our recommendation is a strong presidential executive order, which would underscore the support of the chief executive and the priority attached to this mission. It would spell out the authority of the new Deputy Assistant to the President for National Security to take the lead, including in working with the OMB to come up with what might be called the ideology budget. And it would also send a message, in our view, to other parts of the government, including those with diplomatic and military functions, that this is a center of, at least of direction of policy that they need to take seriously and to collaborate with. And this new Deputy Assistant to the President for National Security would also be charged with taking the lead in the preparation of a biannual strategy report. We conclude this section of the report with proposals for strengthening the State Department, the Department of Defense, and the Broadcasting Board of Governors in their capacity as participants in this process, but not the leaders of it. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Bill. I'd now like to call upon James Glassman, who is the founding executive director of the George W. Bush Institute, which is essentially the think tank at the George W. Bush Presidential Library. Jim served as Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs from June 2008 to January 2009. Before that, he was chairman of the Broadcasting Board of Governors, which directs, among other things, the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and Al Hurra Television. Jim is moderator and host of Ideas in Action with Jim Glassman, which is a weekly series on public policy issues that's aired on more than 100 public television stations around the United States. He has served as president of the Atlantic Monthly magazine, publisher of the New Republic magazine, executive vice president of U.S. News and World Report, and the editor and co-owner of Roll Call. And so we're delighted that Jim is here to comment on this subject. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks.
Well, I want to begin by congratulating Doug and Bill and Abe. This is
really an excellent study, and I have to say I've read or skimmed about 36 of these, and I even wrote one of them, which some people consider the best, the Derigian report of 2003. This is an excellent report for reasons I'm going to go into. It urges America to wage a serious war of ideas against radical Islamists and shows how to organize government to do that task. To the current administration, not just the war of ideas as an activity, but the very phrase is now anathema, a sad development. This fact became evident to me during the transition when I started meeting with members of the new administration's foreign policy team and was warned that it would be unwise, if I wanted to have any impact on their thinking, to use the term war of ideas. I'm still not sure which of the two nouns was more offensive, the belligerent one or the intellectual one. By contrast, my own authorization as Undersecretary was clear. As the National Strategy for Combating Terrorism of 2006 put it, in the long run, winning the war on terror means winning the battle of ideas. Couldn't be clearer than that. And around the same time, President Bush assigned the State Department's Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs the role of government-wide lead in the strategic communications effort to counter violent extremism. To me, that meant conducting a war of ideas. We had some successes, but time was short and there were institutional obstacles. And among those institutional obstacles was the fact that at the State Department, the default position in public diplomacy is to burnish America's image, to make foreigners like us better. That's a problem, which this report goes into, I think, in a very cogent way. By contrast, in the war of ideas, the core task is not to fix foreigners' perceptions of the United States. America's image is not at the center of the war of ideas. It's not about us. But that is a paradigm that's very difficult to change. This is why the most important aspect of this paper, in my view, is that it proceeds not from the question, how do we fix public diplomacy, which is what most of the 36 other papers say, but from this question: how do we address the ideological threats to national security using the nonviolent tools that are associated with public diplomacy? Framing is everything, or almost everything, and I think the authors have framed this issue just right. In fact, it's been my main complaint about public diplomacy that we need to think of it as a set of tools that are directed at specific national security objectives, and that's what this paper does. When I became Undersecretary, my main goal, number one goal, was to marginalize and weaken Islamist extremist groups. It wasn't to bring lots of exchange students here, although that's a nice thing to do, and we continue to do that, and that's where we spend most of our money. I thought that was the number one goal, was to weaken Islamist extremist groups, which, as this study, quoting from the National Strategy for Combating Terrorism of 2006, clearly identifies, the principal terrorist enemy confronting the United States is a transnational movement of extremist organizations, networks, and individuals, and their state and non-state supporters, which have in common that they exploit Islam and use terrorism for ideological ends. The current administration, as this study notes, identifies Al-Qaeda as the enemy. We understood that the enemy is a movement motivated by a common ideology. That ideology is important. Drones can't kill it. Just a few comments about recommendations, specific comments. On organization, Bill's very eloquent, the paper's very eloquent in advocating for a counterterrorist ideology committee residing at the NSC to plan the works of line agencies, but not to execute. This is a tough one, this organizational problem. I think that an NSC-based organization presents a big problem. In the Bush administration, the Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy was given the lead, as I said, in strategic communications with a strong emphasis on countering violent extremism. I headed an interagency committee similar to the CTIC that they proposed, and my vice chair was an NSC official who looked over my shoulder really carefully and made sure I was doing the right stuff. I worked very closely with the NSC. Just as an example, it was the NSC that encouraged, we can use that word, the intelligence community to participate in this group in a very serious way. If you don't have the NSC, that's not going to happen. But the big advantage of housing the group at state was that I had an actual budget and that I could actually execute things. We were operational. We could do things. We could demonstrate. We could say, okay, here's the way you build a network. The NSC can't do that. At least hasn't been able to do that since the days of Ollie North. I understand the author's concerns about a State Department lead, but I have to say that an undersecretary with the support of a president, and we had that, and a secretary, an undersecretary clearly sets the War of Ideas as a top priority, is going to get support at the State Department. That's the truth. There's no easy answer to this one, but my preference is state, although it's a close call. I want to just comment quickly on two other things. One is the Broadcasting Board of Governors, which, as Doug said, I used to chair. That's the very unwieldy name for the U.S. government's non-military international broadcasting, which communicates in more than 60 languages and does put an emphasis on strategic areas like Afghanistan, Iran, Arab nations, China, Vietnam, so forth. Much criticism has been leveled at the BBG in recent years, and I think a lot of it is uninformed and misses the point. The BBG actually does a good job of journalism, given its constraints. The problem is that structurally it's a mess. And as this study says, it needs a CEO. Every organization needs a CEO. Technically, the BBG's CEO is all of the governors. The chair has a little bit more power, but not much. Needs a CEO, needs somebody to actually run it on a day-to-day basis. But a bigger problem is that it suffers from a conflict of mission. And on the one hand, it's by law a journalistic organization whose journalists are protected by a firewall from interference by the State Department. On the other hand, as the law that created it says, it's a tool of American foreign policy. So it's kind of hard to be both. It's not easy to resolve that conflict, but it's just foolish, in my opinion, for the largest single public diplomacy effort of the U.S. government, with a budget that's as big as that of the State Department, on State Department spending on public diplomacy, to be outside the strategic control and coordination of national security policymakers. That's an issue that's raised by this report, and it's a very important one, and it's a very intelligent one, rather as in contrast to some of the other criticism. And then finally, this. Broaden the targets. An ideological offensive and counteroffensive should be directed, in my view, not just at Islamist extremism. There are other good targets of opportunity. I think Islamist extremism is the #1 target, but there are other ones. Cuba, Russia, North Korea, Iran, China. The study mentions Europe. We got fairly far down the road on a plan to initiate a nonprofit organization based in Europe that would become a locus of discussion and networking and promulgate liberal ideas and push back against radical Islamism. We called this organization Problems of Extremism, after the publication that the late Abe Brumberg edited at USIA during the Cold War, called Problems of Communism. Europe is ground zero for Islamist ideology. It is where tribal hatred merges with violent radical tradition, as Olivier Roy has pointed out. And this study properly notes that the challenge of the potential weakening of existing liberal democratic societies with large Muslim populations in Europe that are at risk of being influenced by radical Islamism. Islamist extremism threatens the very core of European liberalism. A war of ideas is critical not just to the success of multicultural Europe, but to the success of the Arab Spring. Whether there are attacks on our shores or not, now is the time for the counteroffensive. President Bush is fond of saying freedom is universal. It's not just for Europeans and Americans. Everybody wants it and deserves it. Fighting a war of ideas not only makes Americans safer, it also accomplishes an important moral purpose. It makes people freer. And that may be an unpopular view in some circles in Washington today, but it's never been more important. Thank you. Thank you, Jim. I'm very pleased to now call Will Marshall to the lectern. He's the president and founder of the Progressive Policy Institute, which was established in 1989 as a center for political innovation in Washington, D.C. In that capacity, he's been one of the chief intellectual architects of the movement to modernize progressive politics for the global age. Will is editor or co-editor of many books. I'll just mention two. One is Memos to the New President, which was published in 2009, and With All Our Might, A Progressive Strategy for Defeating Jihadism and Defending Liberty, which was published in 2006. Will is now on the board of directors, along with Bill Galston, of the National Endowment for Democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doug. And first, thanks to Hudson for including me in this august panel and for organizing this terrific report. It really is rigorous and creative and builds on, as James noted, a series of other investigations into the same topic over the last decade. And I hope will add some momentum to a drive to really do something about this. Not having to serve with distinction or without it in the executive branch, I don't have a dog in the fight as to what is exactly the right kind of organizational scheme for this. So I will sort of yield to those who've been inside and tried to make the apparatus work. And I have my own doubts about, the White House as a locus for this, but then again, that's speaking from ignorance. But we can talk about that maybe in the discussion. What I want to focus on, or to me, sort of the really fundamental question of why hasn't anything happened? 11 years into this struggle, why is it that we're still talking about it? Why don't we have a strategy and a home for it in the United States government for countering the ideology that motivates people to go out and kill Americans, Westerners, and other Muslims? So I want to offer a few thoughts on that, and then throw out a couple of ideas on what this strategic ideas campaign might actually focus on in a concrete way, or what it ought to set for as priorities, assuming that we actually did that. So first, why is it we haven't done anything? I think as Bill pointed out, during the Cold War, we understood that as an ideological conflict. We understood the ideological roots of it and the need to fight the communist creed. We knew that was fundamental to victory, and that our whole strategy was to, in effect, contain it and outlast it, which is, in effect, what we did. But we had the USIA and many other in the broadcast radios and many other organs of government working to weaken the appeal of this ideology. Now, it was a Western ideology, and it had tremendous appeal, particularly to Western publics in Europe, less so perhaps in the United States. But it did not seem like Islamism does to be a wholly alien creed, a creed that doesn't really threaten us with the prospect of mass conversion. We're not going to see that in the United States. Obviously, Europe is different. It is ground zero for, as James suggested, because of the large Muslim immigrant populations there. But there isn't much prospect of Islamism as an idea catching on in the United States. So we think that it isn't terribly threatening, and it is right now at least a creed without a country, excepting, very important and large exception, Iran, which is a different kind of Sunni Islamism. But so far, the Shia Islamism. So far, the Sunni variant hasn't found the home, and so again, it's not a nation state that threatens us, and it looks not so dangerous as communism did. And our thinking seems to be, well, if we can kill the leaders through these very effective counterterrorism capacities that this administration has developed, we can contain this virus until it dies off. I'm not sure that is true. That seems to be one of the reasons we haven't acted here. Another is, as several speakers have mentioned, our unease with an ideology that has religious provenance. Americans have genuine respect for deep religious conviction, not always true in Europe these days. And we quite sensibly don't want to pick fights with 1.5 billion Muslims spread across 150 countries in the world. The whole idea of a clash of civilizations is the Al Qaeda message. It's not ours. There's no reason for us to subscribe to it. So we look at this conflict as fundamentally a debate between Muslims about what it means to be a Muslim. What is the proper interpretation, or at least the political applications of the doctrines of Islam? And we feel that we don't have much to contribute to that, so we don't. A third reason I think we haven't developed the capacities we're talking about here today is what I call the consoling myth of the handful of fanatics. Our enemy is just Al Qaeda. Well, not really. I wish it were true. We've already seen the spread of Al Qaeda affiliates. After 9/11, bin Laden decided that decentralization was a strategy for survival for Al Qaeda. And we've seen the ideology spread to affiliates all around the world in weird places now like Sinai and Mali. Suddenly victories against Al Qaeda Central don't look as final when we see others taking up the banner. But more than that, we've seen, thanks to the Arab Spring, the unleashing of a wave of Sunni extremism around the Middle East. Robin Wright calls it a crescent, a Salafi crescent that's spreading from the Persian Gulf to the Levant to North Africa in the wake of upheavals across the Middle East. We suddenly see these Salafist parties challenging and becoming the fiercest rivals to the Islamic Brotherhood in Egypt, for example. That's something, not the kind of liberal outcome that many hoped when we saw the Arab Spring ferment begin. But I think the biggest problem is that the Islamist narrative strikes a chord among the Muslim mainstream. And this is the hardest part for us to accept. It overlaps to a certain extent with what I'll call a Muslim identity politics. This is a sense of historical grievances against the West, a sense of cultural eclipse, with the United States and Europe being the leaders, having overshadowed the once great unity of the Islamic world and leadership of it. And so there's a feeling out there that even if you're not ready to sign up for jihad and launch terrorist strikes against the United States, a certain sympathy with some of the aims, if not the methods, of these groups. And here I would quibble with the report a little bit. The report talks about, argues that the problem is not anti-Americanism, it's this Islamist ideology. Well, I think it's both. When I look at accounts of why people take up jihad when they get radicalized online, some of them even in the United States, and go off to war, often the motive is revenge. It's often revenge for American drone strikes or what looked to them to be a kind of unequal struggle between mujahideen, freedom fighters, defending Muslims against technological superpower. And so there's almost a sense of cultural patriotism in going off to war. So I think, it's not always self-conscious identification with ideology that inspires people to join the terrorist cause. And that's important for us because it means we need the kind of research that you've talked about. We need to be able to draw careful distinctions between the various shades and varieties of Islamic movements and groups and parties that we're confronting today. And we, to minimize the kind of anti-American blowback that's going to happen as we vigorously prosecute our counterterrorism campaign. And, we may also lack confidence in our own story. Tony Blair came to town a year or so ago and, made the point that, when the West apologized for its historical sins, when we try to get tough on Israel to show that we're even-handed, that balanced in the great Israeli-Palestinian debate, we often end up looking weak and undercutting moderates in the Islamist world, not reinforcing our case. And I guess the flip side of this kind of moral relativism is the feeling that Muslims haven't been ready for democracy, which is now demonstrably false. The polling shows pretty clearly that Muslims want greater personal freedom. They think democracy is the best form of government, but they also want Islam to play a bigger role in political life. And it's the tension there. It's the reconciling of democracy and Islam and political modernity and political Islam that's going to be, I think, the drama that unfolds for the next generation in the Muslim world. And the United States has got to engage that at every level. Very quickly, 4 quick points about what this Strategic Ideas campaign ought to encompass. First, it's going to be stronger if it's not contradicted by official U.S. policy. That is, in the Muslim world particularly, there are grave doubts about America's real commitment to democracy, which is the result of decades of favoring stable, friendly despots over the aspirations of the people that they've been misruling, and that stuck with us. But now that events are in flux, now that there's ferment for change in the region, it really behooves the United States to make a fundamental strategic decision to throw our weight behind modernizers and moderates in the Islamist world, even though that's going to create short-term problems with friendly client states in the region. And we have to weigh the short-term losses, cost of such a shift in policy against the long-range strategic benefits of hastening the strategic changes in the systemic changes in the Muslim world that'll help integrate Muslim countries into the international community. Second, let's not neglect the economic opportunity. I always think in these discussions where we always talk about democracy and political freedom and pluralism and rule of law and power sharing, and all these things are obviously terribly important. But the Arab Spring began with an act of self-immolation motivated by a kind of just a wail of despair against economic corruption and oppression, lack of opportunity. And I think that winning the ideas war is going to entail speaking to the suppressed economic aspirations of the people in the Muslim world and making the case for an open market's ability to meet their material aspirations better than the old model of clientism and the political distribution of economic rewards. To the extent that people in the region become stakeholders in the global economy, they're going to become less susceptible to radicalization. Thirdly, we need to highlight Muslim victims of terrorism. This brings me to quibble 2 with the report, which is the report lays great emphasis on Islamist theory as a reaction to the West and modernity, which is, I think, obviously true. But I think that the attacks on the United States, the far enemy, are often tactical, and that the real enemy seems to be the near enemy, that is, of apostate regimes in the eyes of Al Qaeda and other extremist groups. Certainly, these enemies of God, as Al Qaeda defines them, are fair game for the terrorists. It's okay to kill them. In fact, it's a religious duty to kill them. And so the victims of these ideologies are overwhelmingly Muslim. I heard yesterday that as many as 8 times as many Muslims have died in Al Qaeda attacks or affiliate Al Qaeda attacks as non-Muslims. So the truth is we don't know. Nobody's documented this. We shouldn't wait for the next Robert Conquest to tell us 10 and 15 years from now about a kind of slow-falling slaughter going on in the Arab world. Certainly chronicling this kind of carnage against Muslims should be something that that this institution that's been proposed does. And lastly, rewriting the rules of war. I think one of the most discouraging things I've read in the last decade was this quote from Virginia Muslims radicalized on the internet, who then recruited by Taliban to go to Afpak region to fight in jihad, arrested in Pakistan before they could do that. But one of them said, "We are not terrorists, we are jihadists, and jihad is not terrorism." Well, this is our problem, ladies and gentlemen. This is what we have to change. And it seems to me that certainly the United States should be pushing this line, but we need to organize an international effort to buttress norms against the killing of civilians on any pretext, whether it's resistance to occupation or any other one. I've called for a 5th Geneva Convention. I really do think we need to codify the new rules of war, and we need to define terrorism as unlawful combatants and their crimes as crimes against humanity, by way of taking some of the revolutionary allure and glamour out of jihad and putting faces on the victims and creating an evidentiary and legal basis for indictments in international courts of the people who recruit suicide bombers and terrorists and the people who plan the attacks. And certainly this doesn't require any sophisticated theological knowledge on the United States part about the theologies that the political theologies that we're up against. We would simply be showing solidarity with the victims, the main victims, Muslim victims of Islamism. Thanks.
Abe.
Okay, well, I just thank our two commentators for very interesting remarks. I just wanted to pick up one point that Will had mentioned. The issue of the anti-Americanism is important, but I think one of the key points to keep in mind is that there is this, as I said, a kind of understanding that the West is inevitably hostile. So therefore, when you get the claim that someone is acting in revenge against the U.S., for instance, that has to be understood in terms of an understanding of the U.S. where there's no possibility for not taking revenge because the U.S. has to be hostile. I mean, the clearest example of this was in November of 1979 when a group of fanatic Wahhabis, sort of ultra-fanatic Wahhabis, took over the Grand Mosque in Mecca. And what happens in Islamabad, the U.S. embassy is burned, attacked, and there's fires. And why was that? Well, Khomeini made some comments that got broadcast in Pakistan that the U.S. was somehow responsible for this. But, I mean, look at that situation. What possibly would lead people to think that that could really be the explanation of an attack by Wahhabi fanatics against the Grand Mosque in Mecca? Well, if you assume that the U.S. is hostile to Islam generally, and something bad happens to Islam, then, maybe you can conclude that it had to have been the U.S. and it's reasonable to take revenge against it. But the fundamental fact is that assumption of inherent hostility. I mean, what we have to do is, and especially in the case of the regimes coming out of the Arab Spring, is focus them to the extent we can on the pragmatic issues of their own future, so that whatever past animosity there is towards the U.S., we want them to think not in terms of, well, how do I get back at the U.S. for having supported Mubarak, but rather, what use can I make of the U.S. to do the things that I have to do now to make Egypt a better place? And that obviously has to be the kind of focus that we concentrate on.
And I'll just add a word to that. I don't disagree, Will, that it would be helpful to counter anti-Americanism. I mean, there are a lot of benefits of that, and some of them may be that it would take some of the steam out of the terrorist, the appeal of the terrorists' ideology. But just as a historical matter, what I found when I was in the government and repeatedly trying to get other people in the U.S. government interested in a serious effort against Islamist extremism, one of the things that was generally brought forward by people who were disinclined to do anything in this area was they would argue the problem is basically anti-Americanism, which is to say our own policies. So if the United States, there were people who made the argument, I mean, they took it straight from what some Al-Qaeda leaders said. If the United States got out of the Middle East and didn't base its forces in the Middle East, then Al-Qaeda wouldn't object to the United States. If the United States stopped supporting Israel, then a lot of the problem would go away. So the anti-Americanism argument, as valid as it is, as the way you presented it, is nevertheless used as a way of saying, let's not talk about them, let's talk about us, and we're the problem, and what can we do differently? And it tends to be people who don't like those policies of the U.S. military presence in the Middle East or U.S. support for Israel anyway. So they're just basically riding on the terrorism issue as a way of promoting an agenda that they support, in any event. The other thing that tended to come up was the so-called root causes of terrorism argument. And the two main root causes of terrorism that were put forward, in my experience, were again, the Arab-Israeli conflict, people made the argument, which I think after the Arab Spring political upheavals is a lot harder to make, but people made the argument that the hostility, the instability that we see in the Arab world and the Muslim world in general is all tied more or less proximately to the Arab-Israeli conflict. And if we would solve the Arab-Israeli conflict, a lot of that problem would go away. And the other is the problem of poverty, where people asserted that the real root cause of terrorism was that people are poor and lack economic opportunity. And I don't think that either of those arguments has much merit. And I mean, one of the points that was often made to refute it regarding the economic argument was that there are large parts of the world that are extremely poor, even poorer than most of the Arab world, for example. And the people in those areas, as unhappy and as politically disenfranchised as they are, don't turn into terrorists. And so you need obviously something more to explain the terrorism phenomenon than simply poverty and lack of opportunity. But I think that it's worth calling attention to these points, because if we ever get to the point where we have a president who really wants to do something in this area and wants to launch an effort, and the ideas that our report is promoting begin to be taken seriously, I think it's inevitable that the opponents of these ideas will be reviving these arguments about root causes of terrorism as a way of essentially changing the subject. Now, we'll be happy to take questions from our audience, and as I mentioned before, questions can also be sent in via Twitter to @Hudson Institute, one word. So if what I would like to ask our questioners to do is wait, please, until the microphone gets brought to you, and then if you could identify yourself and your affiliation, I'd be grateful for that. And why don't we start here in the front? Yes. No, well, okay, and then that's fine.
Yes, Brian Marshall. I'll be taking an assignment with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe very soon. I've served on a series of temporary appointments with the State Department in the past in Iraq, and I'd be curious...
Could you speak up a bit?
Sure. Oh, no, it's coming out right. And I'd be curious as to whether the report gives good attention to the work we did in Iraq and also Afghanistan we've been doing. There were a number of projects that we did, and I know Mr. Marshall's organization, NED, was very much involved in Erbil in Iraq, as well as the International Republican Institute on assisting the Iraqis on preparing for elections. I was working at the provincial reconstruction team level. We had a lot of projects, voter education. I headed a civic education project, and instructing Iraqi school children on rule of law concepts, human rights, the role of elections in a democratic society, and this was through grades 1 through 12. Our work wasn't finished, and I regret that very much, but at the same time, we were doing work in this area. The one failing I think that we had was the fact that Iraqis complained that some of our work, particularly in areas such as public health and agriculture assistance, was not being sufficiently publicized to the Iraqi public.
Well, okay, thank you. No, we didn't really deal too much with the situation in Iraq because we were looking at it from a more global point of view. But I think many of the kinds of things that you're talking about are the kinds of projects that would come under this strategy. Now, obviously, Iraq was a different situation since we were there in large numbers with large forces and could operate in a much more direct way than we could, generally speaking. Thanks.
And also, I don't want in any way to deny the existence of or belittle the importance of various efforts that different people around the U.S. government have been making for years that are relevant to the subject. The point we were making is there is no comprehensive national strategy specifically to counter the ideology. And it is certainly true that much of what our forces have been doing on the ground in Afghanistan and Iraq has aimed to change attitudes and change thinking, but that's really quite different from a national strategic ideas campaign of the type that was, is aimed to contradict the way of thinking that bin Laden and other Islamist extremists have been promoting. Please.
Mark Plattner from Journal of Democracy at National Endowment for Democracy. I found the discussion fascinating. I haven't had a chance to look at the report yet, but I am a bit confused as to exactly what the target is meant to be. The initial impression I had from Doug Fife and Abe Shulsky's presentation was that it was a broader conception of Islamist ideology, but then from Bill Galston's presentation, I had the sense, no, it was just the narrow slice of terrorist Islamist ideology reflected in Al-Qaeda and bin Laden. But if, as I think some would argue, the ideological roots were similar, does one attack one and not the other? Would be as if during the communist era one were just to look at the fringe groups that engaged in terrorist activity. But then if you do broaden it out, it seems to me you run into the issue that Jim Glassman raised, which is if we're worried about ideologies that counter liberal democracy, are there not a range of them that may have nothing to do with Islamism that are also should be of critical concern? So I wonder if any of you could comment on how one draws these boundaries.
Okay, go ahead. Okay, well, I mean, you hit on an issue that we spent a lot of time discussing and trying to get clear in our own minds, precisely because Islamism is a very complex kind of phenomenon. And I think the notion that it's just the terrorism is too narrow, because you can have a whole sort of ideological belief system which doesn't call for violence, now, but nevertheless inevitably leads towards it. On the other hand, we wanted to leave open the possibility that various groups, such as the Muslim Brotherhood coming to power in Egypt, would not necessarily go in a kind of violent direction. I mean, in other words, it's a new situation. People react to new situations in ways that are somewhat unpredictable. So that's why I tried to focus in on this notion of a belief in the inevitable hostility of the West towards Islam, because it struck me that that was really to the extent that one could try to draw a line between what we're talking about and what we're not talking about here, what we're aiming at and what we're not aiming at. It seemed to me that that was the clearest sort of indicator of what we were getting at. In other words, somebody who takes the position that the West is so hostile to me that I have to be fighting it all the time because it denies my religion, it's trying to destroy my religion, therefore I can't possibly live with it. Therefore, whether I'm fighting him now, it may be a prudential issue, but in principle, violence is always going to be possible and justifiable because this other guy is out to get me, so I've got to protect myself and so forth. So that, to the extent that I could find a sort of a way of drawing the line, that's what I did. And but you're quite right. I mean, it is a difficult area because it's a very complex phenomenon, and we're in the middle of change. And Phil may want to say something.
Well, not for the first time. Mark has gone to the heart of the matter. We did spend a lot of time discussing, to some extent debating, this very question among ourselves. And to see precisely how we resolved it among ourselves, I commend to you pages 1 and 2 of our report. And just to give you a snapshot, here's the final paragraph of the introduction to our report. After Islamists won popular elections in Tunisia, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton told an audience of young Tunisians, quote, "There are those here in Tunisia and elsewhere who question whether Islamist politics can really be compatible with democracy." Well, Tunisia has a chance to answer that question affirmatively and to demonstrate that there is no contradiction, close quote. In our judgment, this kind of openness to democratic possibilities is a proper basis for American policy unless, and I would add, until the facts on the ground supply a negative answer to Secretary Clinton's question. And so, we have to be binocular here. On the one hand, we have to look at the intellectual and ideological roots of different political movements. On the other hand, we have to attend to the complexities of political reality and the differences that situations can make in the evolution of thought as it grapples with the responsibilities of actually governing a country. And it is our view that it is an open question whether the leadership in Tunisia, the leadership in Egypt, the leadership in Turkey and elsewhere grappling with the complexities of governing actual societies as opposed simply to mounting opposition movements and vigorous rhetoric against the status quo, will be driven to understand that there is something in between Sayyid Qutb on the one hand and French secular republicanism on the other. And there is, in my opinion, there is a lot of ground between those two polar opposites. It would be foolish for Americans to assume that the precise relationship between religion and state power, which has served us pretty well, is possible or even appropriate in the specific circumstances on the ground in countries like Tunisia and Egypt. But now I'll venture far afield from my home base expertise. To say, for example, that Islam ought to be a principal source of law for a new society is to make a statement that has, I don't need to tell you, an enormous number of shades of meaning. Should it be the details of the law, the words of the law? Should it be the principles of the law? Should it be the moral understanding behind the law? Certified Islamists have made all of those arguments and more besides. And depending on which one it is, Islamism may, in those circumstances, or may not, turn out to be compatible with democracy and pluralism. At any rate, and this is the end of this peroration. Okay, we have to pay attention to the fact that democratic votes have brought these governments to power after an extended period in which these populations believed, in the case of Egypt with some justice, that we were not exactly encouraging a transition to democracy as vigorously as we might have. We have no choice in the first instance but to respect that outcome and to work with it as best we can. And so, to come full circle, I think that Secretary of State Clinton articulated the only feasible basis of American policy right now. We ought to be open-minded and experimental and to do what we can. And that's the point of this project, to encourage a positive evolution and outcome to these processes. But who knows?
Before I get to this gentleman, we received a question via Twitter from David Silverman. He asks, how do the panelists assess the efforts of the State Department's Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communications. And I know that Abe Shulsky and I have heard from people, a report from people in that office about their activities. I don't know if you're up on their, it's a fairly new office in the State Department, if you'd like to offer any comments on it, but I know that Abe has.
Well, I can make a really quick comment. You know, one of the things you see in Washington is that when new administrations come in, they come in with the attitude that the guys that came before them didn't know what they were doing, and so we'll never do that. And then after a while, they realize, yeah, you know, maybe they were onto something. So we had something that we called the GSEC, and I can't even remember what it stood for, which is pretty much the same thing as what they have now set up in the third year of their administration, and I think it's generally a good idea from what I understand from some conversation.
Yeah, I think it is a positive development. It is very much more narrowly focused than what we're talking about in the report, however. It's very much focused on Al-Qaeda and on trying to sort of present Al-Qaeda now, especially given the Arab Spring, as sort of passé, irrelevant, of no importance for Muslims and so forth. So that it's I think a positive development, but it's rather narrowly focused, was my impression from hearing Ambassador LeBaron talk about it. So it's a positive step, but it would require sort of more broad-based focus to really come to the sorts of things that we're talking about.
I think to build on what Abe was just saying, I think that this office's activity, this Strategic Counterterrorism Communications Office at State, the activity is positive because it involves the development of tools that are useful for a strategic ideas campaign. And practice makes perfect, so it's good that the U.S. government is doing things in this area. Part of the problem, I would say, with the office is that it's constrained by strategic guidance that it's gotten not to take on any real ideological issues. What it's engaged in is essentially like negative political campaigning against the Al-Qaeda organization. So making Al-Qaeda look bad, making Al-Qaeda look irrelevant, but not arguing that what Al-Qaeda says about the duty of Muslims is wrong. That it doesn't go that far because the administration just doesn't want to engage in the fight against Al-Qaeda on the ideological level. And you know, it has its reasons for that, and you know, as I said, they've been laid out at length by John Brennan in a number of speeches. But the fact that the office exists and the fact that it's developing some tools that with proper strategic guidance I think could be put to even more useful purposes is a good thing. Please.
Thank you for the discussion. This is Tawfiq Hamid from the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. And I have a question for the panelists, which is, what are, in your view, the reasons or the reason behind the attempt to downplay the role of the ideology? Is it simply lack of knowledge, or is it because some people fear they don't know how to deal with an ideology in this field, or is it because of political correctness, or maybe something else?
Can I just answer that? Because I think that this report does an excellent job of describing what some of these obstacles are in a section called Campaign of Ideas and Liberal Democratic Theory. And the gentleman who actually wrote it, I think, can do a better job of explaining it than I can. But I just want to raise 2 points that they raise. One is, and we heard this from Will earlier, that the issue of dealing with an ideology that is based on a distorted view of a religion. So when you get into the religious aspects, And there's a real allergy to that in the U.S. government because people, you know, they take the First Amendment's prohibition on established religion in the United States also as some sort of prohibition on the U.S. participating in matters involving religion abroad. There's two completely different things. So I think that's one. And then the second one is this issue of squeamishness about U.S. government participation in the marketplace of ideas. That's not something we should do, that we're kind of corrupting that marketplace if we as a government participate in it. That is a circle that we tried to square with something that we call public diplomacy 2.0, which is now sort of a hackneyed phrase. Back then, nobody was saying 2.0. But the idea, forget the title. The idea was that our job was not to sit here like I'm doing right now and preach at you as the United States government. It doesn't work very well. People don't want to listen to that. And thank you for listening to this. But really that our job was to convene a broad and deep discussion in which our views would become part of the discussion. That to me is a completely valid participation in this marketplace of ideas. And I think, you know, that may be tactics, but the point is, if you really want to get into this war of ideas, that's probably a good way to do it, rather than having the Secretary of State make a pronouncement about it.
The gentleman in the back row.
Hillel Fratkin of the Center on Islam at the Hudson Institute. Sorry, Hillel Fratkin of the Center on Islam at the Hudson Institute. First, thanks very much for this discussion. Second, a comment on the question that was conveyed. My understanding, especially from remarks of Dan Benjamin, who was the head of the Office at State, was that the subject of your own report, Islamism, really was not a framework for discussion. So in that sense, it really has proceeded in a way along the lines that Doug has described. My question to all of you is concerns what sort of emerged from the discussion, which is that we are in a new situation, which I think is twofold. One part has already been mentioned. We have the Arab Spring. We have the coming to power of Islamist groups in various countries. And as Bill Golson mentioned, there in the ordinary course of politics, there's nothing but to deal with those governments, and perhaps certainly hope that they develop in the direction, in a benign direction. The second aspect is that, and this is very much felt in the region, that the United States is withdrawing from the region, that we're, one way or another, we're not going to be doing very much there anyway, and the issues of, presumptively, of our policies as a pretext for kinds of extremism, for attacks and so forth, would be removed. That's been clear enough as the policy of the present administration, and I think that policy has a lot to, whether it's right or wrong, it has the support of the American public because we're weary of of this area and this problem. My question is, given those two things, would the authors of the report, how would they see not so much the functions, but what would be the objective of the kind of effort they're talking about under these circumstances? What difference does it make in the way in which one would approach this subject now that these two major changes are in place?
Yeah, okay. Let me begin to try to grapple with this. I mean, I don't know that it would have too much direct effect on the sort of programs that we're talking about. I mean, one would, of course, find out whether our this view of us as withdrawing from the region, in fact, does have the ideological effects that some people predicted it would. I suspect that it wouldn't. I suspect it wouldn't particularly change the sort of ideological landscape very much. In fact, it might even make it worse because of a perspective that the extremist views are somehow winning, and that our departure is a result of that. Nevertheless, I mean, I think we would sort of continue in the same way of trying to get the debate within the Muslim world invigorated and doing what we could to support people that try to argue for more positive directions in terms of their own societies and the way in which they're going to try to develop them, and to get off the notion of an inevitable hostility that they have to protect against from the West. So, I think it may make things a little bit harder in some ways. It may make them easier if the other side of the debate is correct. But the fundamental issue is really the same, which is how to make sure that all sorts of voices in the Muslim world that don't support the extremist Islamist view are heard, are able to network with each other, have resources, have platforms, and break through the sort of one-sidedness of the debate as it's existed for some time in the past.
And I'd say that whether the United States is present or not in a number of these areas, Muslim communities are going to be working out their future, and as they do, one hopes there's going to be some debate and opposition to the views that the Islamist extremists are putting forward. And so the strategy that we're proposing the United States adopt makes sense for even regions from which we are withdrawing military forces, because those are still regions that are going to have to be debating the ideological offerings of bin Laden and other Islamist extremists. And I think we have a strong national security interest, whether we're present in a region or not, that it evolve in a way that makes that region a more peaceful, human rights respecting, potentially prosperous area of the world.
Let me just second what Doug said. I think the most constructive way to think about what's happening in the world, in this part of the world, is that the battle is within Muslim society. We are being affected, and affected deeply. We can't end this by pulling out of a particular region. That doesn't make any sense. This is a conflict that needs to be resolved. And I think that our role, in fact, is to promote credible voices within the Muslim communities.
Let me just add to that. As a thought experiment, I find your question very challenging. But I do stumble at the threshold for the following reason. Yes, we don't have a military presence in Iraq. And yes, our military presence in Afghanistan is shrinking and will shrink further. I doubt to nothing, but who knows? But does that mean that we are withdrawing militarily from the Persian Gulf? I don't think so. And I certainly don't expect that. As a matter of fact, it is easier to paint pictures where our presence needs to ramp up, will ramp up, than it is to paint a more benign picture where we would feel in any way secure about withdrawing. As a matter of fact, I see us entering into a variety of bilateral and multilateral relationships with the Gulf nations and others that will bind us to the region militarily as well as diplomatically and financially as far as the eye can see. And if you look at what's at stake, how could it be otherwise? So I think in the politically relevant respect, the respect that's relevant for this discussion, we are going to be seen as present and engaged for good and for ill by the people who are trying to orient themselves toward us as well as towards the evolution of their own societies. 5 years ago, when we reconvene this, it may turn out that we've pulled the plug the way the Brits did, and for the reasons that the Brits did. But I certainly don't expect.
I'll tell you what I would suggest is we take 3 quick questions here. The lady in the front, this gentleman. Can we get the microphone to the lady? Thank you. This gentleman, and then the gentleman on the aisle, 2 rows back. And let's get 3 questions, and then we'll respond. And please.
Hi, I'm Deborah Weiss. I do a lot of writing for Washington Times and Front Page Magazine on Islamist stifling of free speech. And I think this report sounds good. I'll definitely check it out. I appreciated the panel. But it sounded largely like you were saying there's a hole, why aren't we addressing the hole, and kind of implying that there's ignorance. Jim addressed a little more along the lines of what I'm interested in hearing, which is I don't like to usually be partisan, but in this administration, I think it goes much, much, much farther. They're purposely telling everyone to de-link it when they are tying it together at DHS and DOJ and State Department, and I think they're getting a lot of their advice on counterterrorism program from Islamists, and I think that it's more than just not addressing a hole like there's Islamists. I think there's active participation in obfuscating what the real problem is in terms of the ideology.
Okay. This gentleman here.
My name is Hassan. I was born in Tehran, and I've enjoyed the panelists' discussion and the report. I have a small comment and a question. The question is this, that do we know what is the Islam, the message that was revealed more than 1400 years ago to a man named Muhammad, peace be upon him, by the revelation that came down by Jibreel or Gibreel and is recorded in a book named Quran. Now, I don't know how many of the panelists have read this book or parts of it, or they have discovered the understanding of it, or to be able to draw a line between a real Muslim or terrorist or Islamist and prescribe correction, like a doctor that never went to school and didn't study medicine is given a medicine to a patient that thinks has a headache, and unfortunately maybe it has ulcer in the stomach, and the aspirin is going to make him bleed to death. So it is so important for us in this country, which we have taken the banner of the most powerful, most advanced, most rich, most progressive country in the world, that our aim is to help all the other nations to be so ignorant of 1.8 billion Muslims of the world, which is 1 out of 4. We have 7 billion people in this world. So 1 out of 4 are Muslims. Now, some of these people, of course, maybe they have no education, they have no food to eat, maybe they don't have a place to live, but they're so strongly connected to their creator that when they feel threatened, they come at you with all force, and we call them terrorists. Maybe they're not, they're just defending their faith in the face of a danger that they feel from us coming through the drones. As one of the panelists said, the drones are killing people now, not us. And it is such an anger among the Muslims in the world toward us, and we need to make sure that they know we're on their side, not against them.
Okay. Could we? Thank you. Pass the microphone back. 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, okay.
I like to please.
Right. Please.
Thank you. My question is.
Could you identify yourself, please?
Yeah, I am Ahmar Masti Khan, and I'm a freelance journalist. My question is, my concern is the battle of ideas between the liberals and the conservatives when it comes to political Islam. we would have wished they should have, you see, one view when it comes to political Islam and Sharia also. There are some who say Sharia is all right, which is, I think...
Could you speak into the microphone, please?
Yeah. Some people think that Sharia is all right, you see, to be practiced in the West. I come from a Muslim country where I lived most of my life. I think that is a very dangerous proposition. My second question is, Saudi Arabia is the elephant in the room who no one wants to see. They are the main financiers of terrorism. And we are not talking about democracy and secularism in Saudi Arabia. My third question is, most of the world's terrorists are in Pakistan, but we are, you see, soft pedaling on Pakistan. Can the please very able speaker say something on that?
All right. Will, you want to start on any of this? And
Okay, well, let's see. I didn't quite understand the first point. Well, I'm not aware of Islamists advising this administration on how to deal with political Islam, and I don't think they are. And I think that the administration started, as James said, with a kind of determination to narrow the lens, you know, that is to take the GWAT, Global War on Terror, and bring it down to a manageable task of defeating, dismantling, disrupting Al-Qaeda. And they may be overcorrected, you know, in the sense that everything was devoted to that end and to a kinetic counterterrorism policy that works on the ground but doesn't deal with the problem of recruitment and therefore gives us no end in sight, which is why I think we have to have the discussion we're having today. But, you know, I would just say that we've had two administrations now, from one Republican and one Democrat, who have failed to create this kind of strategy and a organizational home for the war of ideas, or I don't like that, the strategic ideas campaign. Too many wars in this country. So, you know, so there's a fundamental problem. The public doesn't think, you know, we haven't made our case to the public yet. And as cleverly designed as this proposal is and this organization is, that isn't enough either. We have to make the case to people that the danger is grave enough, and maybe you know, an expanding drone war that begins to hit, to extend American military power into other places where it hasn't gone, and which creates what I do think is an action and reaction cycle with blowback possibilities. I don't think this is all about ideology. You know, that could get people's attention. But right now, it looks like a manageable problem. The ideology doesn't seem to be particularly threatening directly to us. And an interesting thought experiment is what would happen if we bought peace from the terrorists? That is, if somehow we could get them to stop attacking American targets and go back to things like they were before 9/11, although Iran was attacking American targets. But you know, would we you know, then let Muslims sort it out among themselves, this great battle over interpretations of political Islam? I hope not, because you know, we have a huge stake in the political change in the region, and this idea seems to be, to me, something that, as I said at the beginning, ought to go in parallel with the official policy of the United States, which is to support the forces of modernization and moderation in that great change that's coming.
Well, I just want to address this gentleman's very sensitive question, and let me just say to start with that anyone who worked for me who got into doctrinal arguments about the true nature of Islam, if I could fire that person, which I couldn't because that person was a government worker, would get fired. I mean, that's just not that's not the business that we're in, to have arguments about doctrine. But I do think that, just kind of picking up on my earlier comments, this is what we're talking about is an ideology that is based on, I think we can all agree to this, a distorted view of Islam. And I think we have every right and responsibility to push back against it as hard as we can. And I don't think it really has very much to do with our understanding of a great religion. I do think, however, that it is necessary for us to understand that religion, and I think my experience is very few people who are engaged in this at a policy level do.
Well, the question was how much support, what percentage of the 1.8 billion Muslims, I don't know if that's the right number, but that there are in the world, what percentage support the Islamist extremist views? I think part of the problem is, with a question like that is you don't have the ability to take accurate public opinion polling in large parts of the world where you don't have political freedom. Polls aren't always accurate even in countries where there is political freedom, let alone in countries that there isn't. So it's just very hard to know. That's why it's an extremely good idea never to take seriously somebody who professes to speak on behalf of the people in places that are not politically free. And
But let me just say this, Doug. There is a question that's out there that's asked frequently, which it's asked in different ways, but the point is, do you believe that the West is out to destroy Islam? And large majorities, as you know, in Muslim majority countries believe that. And that is at the core of the ideology. So I think that there are parts of this ideology that are pervasive. I mean, ultimately, the ideology is used, sort of the model is you take alienated young people who don't have an identity and kind of isolate them and bombard them with ideology. But it works in other areas as well. But it helps if they've already had a taste of that ideology, or if it kind of permeates the atmosphere. And I think that's the problem, and it is hard to quantify.
I do want to emphasize that one of the things that we advocate in our report is a research capability for the U.S. government so that you would have people who would be operating in this area on the basis of much better information than generally exists. And I mean, the basic warning that you don't want people operating in a policy area out of ignorance is a valid point for this subject matter and for every other subject matter. And after World War II, there was an enormous increase in investment in Russian studies, for example. And there's a sound reason for that you do want to study anybody that is either your enemy or has the potential to be your enemy. And if you want to influence people, you want to understand them well. And so an extremely serious effort to understand this phenomenon is something that we are advocating in our proposal. Are there any other comments that you wanted to make? And then I know that Bill you wanted to pose a question.
Yeah, and then maybe this is a way of bringing this discussion to, if not a natural conclusion, at least a needed.
Supernatural.
Yeah, and that is this, and this in a way repeats and intensifies Will's question. There are three people, on this panel who served in important positions of responsibility in an administration where the consciousness of this issue not only is a practical problem, but is a problem that involved thought and principles, was sky high. And yet, I've worked with Doug and Abe on this question now for some years, and I've got to talk with Jim a little bit. There seems to be a consensus that the institutional response and the programmatic response to what must have been seen as a problem was somewhere between inadequate and non-existent under the circumstances where the most important condition prior, namely the support of the President of the United States, was present. Why not? And if it didn't happen then, is there really hope that it can happen under other circumstances? I'm quite serious.
Well, it's an important question, and I was in the administration from the Bush administration from 2001 until the summer of 2005. And I saw something of an evolution of thinking about the ideological part of the terrorism problem. Initially, it was clear what the president was mainly concerned about was anything that would reinforce the enemy's propaganda that the United States was anti-Islam and was fighting, that the war on terrorism was a war against Islam. He was extremely sensitive to that issue. He was, you recall, within, I think it was a week of the 9/11 attack, he visited the mosque here in Washington. He had at the fore of his mind the danger that the war on terrorism would appear to be a war on Islam, and if it did, we would be aggravating a problem that we were trying to mitigate or solve. And so I think that's initially part of the answer. If you look over and I talk about this in my book, War and Decision, and I present some documents in there that are relevant to this. If you look initially at the strategic guidance for the war on terrorism, it tended to focus initially on things that could be accomplished immediately in the military, law enforcement, intelligence areas. Hardening the homeland and striking at terrorist targets and the like. Whatever was going to be done at the ideological level was clearly a longer-term effort. And in the immediate aftermath, in the immediate months after 9/11, where there was a strong anticipation that follow-on attacks were imminent, the focus of the government was on things that could be done immediately with immediate effect rather than on things that would bear fruit only over a longer period. So I think that was another part of the reason for the problem. Now, what happened was over the years, even within the Bush administration, there grew, increasing interest in taking on the ideological aspects of the problem. It's not that people were not aware of the ideological aspects, but there were various reasons why they tended to get downplayed initially. I think that the growing awareness of the ideological nature of the problem is the reason that Jim Glassman was eventually given responsibility that, if he had had enough time to implement it, might have turned out to be a very significant effort. But I think that a large part of the problem was that I also think we had a number of false starts early on, as I said in my opening remarks. Whenever we talked about this problem, our colleagues in the State Department, in a way that is kind of typical for that bureaucracy, tended to think about doing the things that they had offices already set up to do, which is, messaging exercises, rather than the kind of operational approach that we're proposing in our report. But for one reason or another, and there are a number of reasons, and as I said, the reasons changed over time, the Bush administration didn't do anywhere near as good a job in this area of the war on terrorism as it did in other areas. And then I think, as Will and as others have pointed out on this panel, the Obama administration came in with affirmative ideas that were in opposition to an ideological effort. And so for all of those various reasons, neither administration has done what we think needs to be done in this field. I think with that we are out of time, but I want to express great gratitude to my colleagues, Will Marshall, James Glassman, and Abe Shulsky and Bill Galston for this excellent discussion, and thank all of you for your attention.
James or Jim? Either. Okay.